Corn cares not from where the blood flows, but still preferably, I think most people would have it flowing from the enemy rather than your force. Let's talk through the armies that would rank as the top 5 melee armies in Warhammer 40k right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking glorious close combat, and in this video I thought we'd talk through some of the strongest melee competitive armies that people can play in game right now, and a few of the things that make them so strong. Range versus melee has often been a bit of a problematic balancing point for Warhammer 40k and past editions. I certainly remember in 8th edition that the core rules just favoured shooting really quite a lot, and unless you were playing with some fairly specific terrain setups, then you might have trouble hiding virtually any units on the board. And it certainly felt for some armies that building around a close combat orientated force could be a bit of an uphill struggle. In 9th edition and 10th edition that doesn't really seem to have been the case quite so much though. Games Workshop implementing good line of sight rules I think have really helped, so it means that melee armies can be a lot more scary, moving up the board from different staging areas in ground floors of ruins and things, and forcing some ranged armies to move up to actually try and gain line of sight, and perhaps play a little bit more aggressively than they might have in the past. In this video for the new Pariah Nexus meta, I thought it might be interesting to talk through the armies that are looking strongest for all-in melee power, maybe aiming for armies that, as a rough sort of rule of thumb, might use perhaps 75% of their main threats being melee damage dealers as opposed to range. Talk about their early performance in Pariah Nexus and what makes them strong in terms of their best units and supporting rules, and one example army list that's done well in the past couple of weeks. Jumping straight into it, and first up we have Blood Angels. Despite having kind of minimal changes in the past balanced data slates, they've really soared up the rankings in Pariah Nexus, winning around about 55% of games, lots of high placings and 2 grand tournament wins already. It's quite nice to see these Sons of Sanguinius genuinely strong again. They certainly started out 10th edition being kind of underwhelming. As per all Space Marines, they can focus down one target with Oath of Moment for some big rerolls for some Assault Intercessors or something charging in. Getting 4 rerolls to hit and wound can be kind of big there. Blood Angels list typically used their Sons of Sanguinius detachment. Games Workshop giving them the boost of going from +1 strength to +2 strength was a massive deal for that. It means that you get Chainswords up to strength 6 and Power Fists up to strength 10, both of which are pretty massive breakpoints. Then one of the other really massive things about the detachment is the Red Rampage stratagem. That's an enormous melee force multiplier, lethal hits and lance. It's a really nasty combo and means that any sort of mid-strength type things will punch up enormously if they're hitting tough stuff like monsters and vehicles, and it makes basically any unit in Blood Angels highly likely to take a big chunk out of literally anything that they charge. They've got some other nice support as well, such as fallback and charge and a bonus consolidation, plus a few usable enhancements, though I probably wouldn't say that they're the biggest source of strength. For strong melee units for the army, captains and assault intercessors have a particularly good home here. They're often seen jumping out of impulsors and then hopefully trying to make a charge onto midfield objectives, activating the captain's big +3 attack melee boost. The captain can allow you to use that Red Rampage stratagem for free if needed, unless it's not needed and something else makes more sense, and if you used Oath of Moment on their targets, they could be re-rolling all hits and all wounds, maybe with the Red Rampage buff thrown in, but certainly with extra attacks and +2 strength from Sons of Sanguinius. They're just a massive level up versus other Space Marine chapters here. Perhaps the biggest feature of Blood Angels melee though are Death Company, taking Inferno Pistols and Power Fists and getting big re-roll hits, all the scary detachment things when they charge in, and they can either be fielded with Lamartes or Jump Chaplain, Lamartes giving them an extra damage boost and also their -1 damage thing that makes them at least somewhat hard to take down, or Jump Chaplain just to keep up their objective control and give them +1 to wounds. They work quite well on foot out of a transport with a Chaplain as well. You could get them there via Land Raiders or Rhinos. Otherwise, Jump Intercessors are just really strong secondary fast movers for most chapters. They can skirmish well with enemy light infantry, and lots of chapters are taking them anyway. Again, in Blood Angels they get massively better with Sons of Sanguinius. The Sanguinor is a common choice for a lone operative that can just step up to the plate and help rebuff an enemy charge. His big heroic intervention move with Fights First is really nasty, and given the melee damage boost for the detachment, a lot of other more generic Space Marine melee can get used here as well. I have seen people using Vanguard veterans, Blade Guard veterans, Jump Captains to go alongside either the Vanguard or the Jump Intercessors, and occasionally Sanguinary Guard as well. Though I'd still say they're probably a bit overcosted versus the Death Company. Finally for the Blood Angels, here's just one example of all of that put together in a tournament winning list by Ben Jurek. 2 enormous terrifying squads of Death Company with jump packs, led by Lamartes and a Jump Chaplain, 2 chaplains with smaller Death Company squads that look like they're packing themselves into a rhino, an on-the-board captain with a squad of assault intercessors in an impulsor, and jump intercessors and a sanguinor to support. That's pretty terrifying for any of those nasty threats getting to grips with the core of your army, and of course they can move really fast. Before we move on, I thought I'd just quickly mention one way in which people can help support the channel if they'd like to. If you were looking to pick up any units for your armies at all, then there's plenty of places that can get Games Workshop's kits at a discount versus their own web store. I've got 4 of those links down in the video description: Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Wargame Portal in the USA. Those give somewhere between 10 and 20% of Games Workshop's prices, and if you buy through any of those links, it can be one way to help support the channel on things that you would have bought anyway. They don't cost any extra to use. A big thank you to all of you guys who do pick up things through there when you happen to order in some models. They are one of the factors that helps keep all the videos coming and me doing this full time. Moving on though to our next glorious close combat army, and we've got the Chaos Daemons. They also seem to be having a very good time of it in Pariah Nexus, with early win rates around about 52%. They certainly weren't doing too badly before, and then they jumped up a fair bit with the Greater Demon buffs and a bunch of points cuts that they got. They have already won 1 grand tournament, and I'm sure there'll be more on the way. Chaos Demon lists certainly can use a bit of shooting, with things like Flames of Tzeentch, Skull Cannons, and a few others, but typically they tend to be a pretty dedicated melee faction beyond that. One of the scariest things that the Demons can do is to deep strike 6 inches away via the Shadow of Chaos. That was already very threatening with certain ways that they could push that out into the midboard, but now every single Greater Demon basically gets an aura of that to deliver their units up close. It's just very, very easy to basically get guaranteed charges out of reserve or near enough. I feel like it's going to be pretty common that we see things like Bloodthirsters just dumping a whole load of Bloodletters or Blood Crushers right on the enemy in the midboard, and there's very little they can do about it. They also have a stratagem for a 1 CP advance and charge in the shadow, again easier to access that than ever, and the Greater Demons will basically always be able to use that. And then there's a further stratagem for extra AP and then reroll wounds in melee if you happen to be within the Shadow of Chaos. That can be absolutely massive with things like Hellblades trying to take down tougher targets. For strong melee units, most of the Greater Demons are worth a mention, particularly the Khorne and Slaanesh ones. I feel like the Bloodthirster won enormously out of the last update, both going down in points and getting the Shadow Aura, which is really relevant for lots of supporting Khorne units, plus advance and charge, and always getting Argath King of Blades on the boosted version of it is really massive. Scarbrand's incredibly scary as well. Shalaxi Hellbane will destroy most heavy hitters in a single round of combat. Keepers of Secrets are pretty nice anti-elite sort of melee and move very fast. And probably worth mentioning the Great Unclean one, who can waddle up the board with ridiculous amounts of durability. It's maybe a little bit more of a mixed threat and isn't desperately crazy in melee, but certainly very happy to wind up there. Otherwise I'd probably say that the standout melee of the faction is kind of appropriately Khorne at the moment. Blood Crushers are a really common pick, maybe backed up by a Ren Master on Bloodthrone, who can basically mark a unit for Khornate death each turn, improving strength, AP and damage by 1. He can also work with the Bloodletters as well, who can still be pretty scary with character support, maybe taking Skull Taker or something. And Fleshhounds are really quite nice outrider units that can still maul most normal enemy units who might be running around taking objectives. Quite nice to have a bit of on-the-board speed. Beyond that, loads of stuff that's still really usable. Celeste is pretty nasty. Fiends I think are looking way better at 105 points. Plague Bearers and Nurglings are maybe more about objective support and disruption respectively, but still won't be doing any damage and things outside of combat. Here's one example of Chaos Demons in Pariah Nexus, this one run by Blair MacDonald, who used it to take a grand tournament at Geekfest Summer Heat. A Bloodthirster and Great Unclean one leading the way, both with their enhancements. 2 units of 6 Blood Crushers and 1 unit of Bloodletters that could be deep striking with the Bloodthirster support. Skull Taker can lead the Bloodletters, and there's a Ren Master that can deal a bunch more damage to 1 unit that's focused by some Khorne things. Nurglings and Plague Bearers in support, even an allied Wardog Carnivore just in case more melee was needed, and the Skull Cannons can be a ranged option, but they can also be pretty relevant if you want to be able to reroll wounds against your target. Making the enemy unit battle shocks can be pretty nasty to access the boosted version of their stratagem. Next up, to our third army, we've got the Space Wolves. It looks like for their early Pariah Nexus performance, they're one of the single strongest armies in the game. Win rates of a massive great big 57%, and seem to be doing great since their Thunderwolf nerfs. Again, they've already won 1 grand tournament, which isn't too bad given that they're not a hugely widely played army. As with the Blood Angels, they can get Oath of Moment for some focal damage each turn. Very nice on anything that hits on a 3+, and it seems that they've got two fairly equal viable ways to play at the moment, either going Stormlance Task Force for big Thunderwolf support, or new and improved Champions of Ross. The Stormlance means that they can advance and charge with the Thunderwolves, and that can get them up across the board really quite quickly, particularly if you've got a Wolf Lord with +1 to advance and charge. And then lots of good things to support mounted units. Getting the -1 to hit and wound at long range is a big one. They can threaten some obscenely long charges if you pay the CP for them, potentially get Lance melee, or first turn arrive from reserves enhancement. Most lists take 3 units of 6 of them there. Otherwise, as I expected, Champions of Ross is definitely seeing play with the big buff that it got in the balanced data slate. You either get to start with sustained or lethal hits on it in melee, unless you want the feel no pain more. And you could certainly pick the hardest one of those to unlock and then hope you unlock the other one through the course of the game. And then beyond that, they've got an AP and a Lance melee stratagem if you've got the right Saga, a bigger consolidate move, and potential advance and charge again if you've got the right Saga on the go. Depending on which one that you choose, you might have some boosted options. It still looks like Thunderwolf Cavalry aren't really going anywhere as the big scary central melee threat for the Space Wolves. They're fairly fast, fairly cheap, and fairly dangerous, getting a damage buff when they charge in, particularly as they hand out that +1 damage to all attached characters. Then they've got a perhaps slightly surprisingly good support character choice, Wolfguard Battle Leaders for lethal hits and a very nasty reactive move that can be impactful. Logan Grimnar and Storm Rider for a big chunky model with some melee threat and a huge turn of reroll charges and all hits in melee army-wide. Wolf Lords for stratagems and bonuses to charge and things, and Harold Deathwolf as well. Wolfen are still strong for their stat lines despite the points increase, even if OC0 does mean that they're even less used for secondary objectives and things than before. And otherwise for unique stuff, Ulrich and Bloodclaws can work well, Ragnar and Assault Intercessors could be quite nice, and Bjorn and Murderfang are both usable. Murderfang maybe being a bit all or nothing, but multiple activations in melee could be enormously dangerous. As with the Blood Angels, Jump Intercessors from the core codex work absolutely fine for any Space Marines as well, and Space Wolves do tend to have at least some things to support them in close combat. Here's one example of a strong Space Wolf list from last weekend, this one run by Terence Drew, and this one's a Stormlance list with the maximum amount of Thunderwolves, 3 units of 6 of them with shields, led up by Logan Grimnar, 2 Wolf Lords, and a bunch of battle leaders. One of them has the Arrive from Reserves early enhancement. There's then a fair few jump packs to support, 2 units of Jump Intercessors and 1 of Vanguard Veterans, a Jump Chaplain presumably running with the Veterans, and then some nice supporting units with a bunch of Intercessors, Heavy Intercessors, Scouts, and a Combi Lieutenant. Absolutely terrifying to have 3 enormous melee threats rushing your lines, particularly with things like reactive moves and -1 to hit and wound at range. You certainly can't take any of those units of Thunderwolves lightly. Next up, it looks like the boys in gold have reclaimed their spot as one of 40k's more scary melee armies. They've certainly risen up a fair bit in Pariah Nexus so far. They did get some nice buffs with the data slates, like their defensive stratagems working against devastating wounds once more, plus a good boost to the shield host. I feel like the captain stratagem changes worked in their favour quite a lot. For their core rule, they all hit on 2+ with some scary Guardian Spear type profiles, and each turn that's further augmented by Martial Qatar, allowing you to use sustained or lethal hits as it makes sense, so basically flat extra damage of your choosing, whatever's best for the thing that you happen to be in combat with. Out of the detachment, since the update, Shield Host really seems to have gone from being kind of equally played to utterly dominant in terms of what people are playing in tournaments. It did get a pretty enormous buff in the data slate, to be fair. You either get to have critical hits on a 5+ each time you attack, so far more sustained or lethal hits, or an extra AP -1 if that's going to make more difference against your given foe. So basically the Custodes just got flat fightier, and that's where they do the majority of their damage for the most part. That one also backs up things like stratagems for Avenge the Fallen to help out depleted units a bit, a -1 to hit in melee stratagem that can be okay, and an option to fall back and shoot and charge that can keep things flexible as you're skirmishing in the midboard. There's quite a nice melee enhancement for a shield captain as well, giving you +1 to your strength and damage of your melee weapons. I feel like getting a damage 3 on a custodian style profile really is a difference between him being just slightly better than a regular guy and actually genuinely a big threat in their own right. The other detachments like Talons of the Emperor and Auric Champions do have some good stuff as well, though I feel like for melee custodians, Shield Host really just doubles down on that being the way to go right now. For melee units, the vast majority of the Adeptus Custodes basically fights in melee. Most lists tend to build around a good core of Custodian Guard and Wardens, chunky golden bodies with good saves, built-in deep strike, and a strong 5 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with the Guardian Spears, with access to lethal hits when they need it. That really is a very generalist profile and should be able to bully most normal sized enemy units. The Custodian Guard can potentially pick up 4 rerolls to wound if they can take an objective, and the Wardens get their extra durability, -1 to wound and their 1 big turn of feel no pain. After the update, I feel like the Venatari Custodians are perhaps one of the single strongest things that the Custodes have to offer right now. They've got snazzy jump packs with built-in rapid ingress, and given that they're not really all that much more expensive than regular Custodian Guard, these basically seem to be in auto-include territory right now if you have some. Getting Lance on a Guardian Spear profile certainly doesn't hurt as well. Otherwise, to lead them into battle, Blade Champions are hard to patch up. They've got really quite good efficient melee with their big damage 3 profile. Again, can be very nasty in general purpose with lethal hits, and they can allow you to advance and charge for a turn, so deliver their squad into melee too. Shield Captains are just nice all-rounders with their free stratagems and a single turn of a melee boost, and Allarus Custodes may be often in a bit more of a supporting type role, but they certainly can melee fairly hard with their anti-heavy kind of rules and being able to teleport around the board, maybe even to threaten first turn charges, even if it's a bit unlikely. Here's one example of a strong Custodians list for the first couple of weeks. This list by Keenan Elliott takes 2 Blade Champions and a Terminator Shield Captain to lead it. The champions look like they're fighting alongside the Custodian Wardens as tanky units that are very dangerous to fight for the midfield. The Shield Captain goes with a big 5-man Allarus Custodian squad, so a pretty awesomely powerful teleporting threat there. And there's also a Custodian Guard that do have melee power but can be incredibly shooty with Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus, taking an objective and then double firing with 4 wound rerolls. Then to support them, there's a fairly fighty and fairly fast Shield Captain on Jetbike with the Armies upgrade for the extra strength and damage. Interesting to have him ranging around as a lone ranger. And then 2 Venatari Custodian units with lances. Big scary rapid ingress units that are going to be hard to avoid with their +1 to wound on the charge with lance. Definitely a good example of how to put your foe to the Guardian Spear. Finally, for the top 5 melee armies I'd rank right now, we have the World Eaters. Again, like the Custodes, it looks like they're starting on around about a 52% win rate in Pariah Nexus, and again it looks like they've gained a little bit post-update. They did get a few helpful points cuts to 8-bound. World Eaters basically do nothing but melee, so if they're strong they're probably going to make this list. All of their rules go to support close combat. Blessings of Khorne can potentially get you a +2 inch move and an advance and charge combo if you roll well. If you are able to do that, then you should have very easy first turn charges, particularly with access to a 6-inch advanced stratagem. You could basically have your units move 8 inches further than their normal profile would suggest and still make a charge after that. Otherwise, the blessings can give you extra damage buffs, extra durability, and fights on death, which is excellent for countering other melee armies if they might be about to strike back hard. And their core detachment ability gives you +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, just in case you needed any more motivation to jump into combat with things. The stratagems are generally quite melee focused as well. They've also got a +1 to wound against characters and heavies, and -1 damage if they're in melee, and an enhancement called the Berserker Glaive that can be alright on things like a Master of Executions, even if it's a lot pricier than it was to field them that way. For melee units, basically all their unique things are really quite usable and strong. 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound are the premium melee damage dealers of the index, particularly following the points drops. The regular 8-bound scout up the board very fast and will blend the vast majority of enemy infantry units with a massive amount of attacks. And then the Exalted 8-bounds again can move really quite quickly. They could potentially deep strike or rapid ingress, or again be made to scout up like the rest with Lord Invocatus. Angron's a staple in just about every list. He moves really fast and hits very hard. He'll soak up a ton of fire and the opponent can't afford to ignore him, and then he might come back from death. Khorne Berserkers and Rhinos are nice to skirmish over the midboard, maybe with Khan or a Master of Executions if you want a bit more bite against tough stuff. They're very good at cutting down just about any medium or lighter infantry though, and Blood Surge is really quite a nice special rule for them, meaning that the opponent can't just put things right next to them to contest objectives and then shoot them to death, not unless they want to wind up in combat. Morphines are also alright for a bit of heavy hitting, and Jackals can be nice for some cultist support that are good with objectives and things, and also threaten a lot more of their contemporaries than you might expect, as you'd hope the World Eaters are certainly overflowing with violence. Here's an example of a recent successful World Eaters list that went undefeated and was run by a user KNRR. This one's an interesting one in that it ditches Berserkers completely, although I feel like most lists I see at least run some of them. And instead we've got Angron, Lord Invocatus, and a Juggernaut Lord with the Brazen Eye at half damage enhancement, leading to horrendously scary blocks of 6 Exalted 8-bound, 2 smaller units of regular 8-bound, and some Jackals and Spawn, and then a little bit of demonic fire support from a couple of Forge Fiends with triple Ectoplasma cannons that should put some good hurt on enemy elites and maybe soften up targets for the big charge. Finally, just to round up a few other more melee focused armies, I feel like it might have been worth mentioning Sister's Penitent Host. I feel like this one hasn't had as much attention as some of the other detachments, as they're all really quite good, and that one's the most specific with model requirements, but it certainly can make their Penitent keyword units incredibly fast and incredibly deadly, things like Arco-Flagellants and Mortifiers and Penitent engines rocketing across the board, and make Repentia playable, though I think they're a bit overcosted if they're outside of this. But with access to the crazy combos they can do in this one, they can tear down most anything in the game in a single round of combat. Will be interesting to see if anyone manages to have some tournament success with it. Otherwise, Orcs are probably an army that I might have liked to see on this list, though it just looks like their initial performance at the start of Pariah Nexus just really hasn't been good. Games Workshop hit them with quite a broad battery of nerfs. Meganobs maybe a bit depressingly double nerfed, lots of hits to Green Tide, and a few other bits. It generally seems to have had them flipped from being basically one of the strongest factions in the game to one of the weaker ones. Black Templars are still fine, but seem not to be doing quite as well as some of their rival chapters like Space Wolves and Blood Angels in early Pariah Nexus, maybe being a little bit more mid-tier. Righteous Crusaders is still a nice enough detachment though, and Sword Brethren can be incredibly scary, particularly when backed up by an Emperor's Champion or High Marshal Helbrecht, and they can certainly flood the board with a million Crusaders with good feel no pain type saves as well, if you just want to bully enemy off objectives. Drukhari can be really quite melee heavy, with things like Incubi and Witches charging from Raiders or Venoms being the core damage dealing of the army. In general though, I feel like they didn't really belong on the melee armies list, given that they typically tend to be fairly combined arms with a good bit of shooting along as well. I'd say the same is true for Tyranids at the moment. Certainly in the past they've been a bit more classically melee, but the vast majority of army lists these days seem to be really quite balanced between a good amount of biocannon shooting, and certainly not all in Zerg Rush type armies. In any case though, let me know what you make of the melee armies of Warhammer 40k. Which ones would you rate as the strongest and weakest in the game right now? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, if you're looking to pick up any units for your armies or any hobby supplies in general, feel free to check out the links down in the video description. They can be one way to save money versus Games Workshop, and also support Auspex tactics and video creation a bit if you'd like to. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I will be posting new 40k videos just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's somewhere that you can support the channel a bit more directly if you'd like to. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.